Today is the deadline for the IRS to fulfill a request by the House Ways and Means Committee. The ask is for 6 years of President Trump's personal and business tax returns. The administration blasted the request, calling it a ploy to use the IRS as a political weapon.
Democrats disagree. Yesterday, Congresswoman Maxine Waters, chair of the House Financial Services Committee, took Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin to task over this matter.
Secretary Mnuchin, will you comply with the law by the deadline tomorrow and furnish the tax returns, even if it means you may be fired by this president for doing so?
As I've previously said, I want to acknowledge we have received the request. As I've said before, we will follow the law. We are reviewing it with our internal legal department, and I would leave it at that.
What you are basically saying, you follow the law, and you're not afraid that you will be fired if, in fact, you release the returns.
Well, I'm not afraid of being fired at all.
Ways and Means Committee member Congressman Dan Kildee of Michigan says that the law is clear, tweeting, "When a tax return is requested, the IRS shall furnish such committee with any return or return information specified. No one, not even the president, is above the law." Congressman Kildee joins us now to discuss the House Ways and Means Committee's request and how the committee plans to go forward. In addition to sitting on Ways and Means, he is also the Chief Deputy Whip. Congressman, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Nice to see you.
Hey, thanks for having me back.
So what do you expect to happen here today?
Well, I mean, we don't expect that they will comply. They clearly have access to 6 years of returns for the president's individual return and these 8 business entities that we think are important to take a look at. They've had a week to comply. It's fairly clear that they're slow walking this. The president's own lawyers wrote to the Treasury Department essentially warning them that they should not release these returns. And just to be clear, when we talk about releasing the returns, we're not suggesting that the returns would be made public, nor that even the full committee, let alone the full House, would have access to them. This is a law that allows the chair of the committee to review these returns in order to inform deliberations of the committee, and that's what we're asking for.
Congressman, you would also then suggest that there wouldn't be a leak of those returns if they were in fact to be furnished? You would have faith in that process? We wouldn't all of a sudden see Trump's returns making their way to MSNBC or somewhere else?
Well, I know Richie Neal pretty well, and he actually has been criticized by a lot of people for being very deliberate in this process. A lot of folks wanted him to ask for these returns on January 3rd. I think he'll take great care. It would be a violation of the law to release the returns, and it would be fairly evident where they came from if, in fact, that were to take place. So, no, I take that very seriously. Look, around here, we have access to highly classified information all the time. The chair of the Intel Committee, for example, does. Other members of Congress do. This is a law that is used with regularity. It's not some arcane law that had to be dusted off. The thing that is unusual is that because the president has not been willing to follow nearly 50 years of norms and release his own tax returns so that we could make this evaluation without having to use Section 6103, that makes it unusual that it's applying to the president. But this is law that is used with regularity, and there hasn't been a release as a result of the 6103.
Congressman, could I just ask, the administration so far is very confident that when this goes before a judge, that the people that want to get the president's tax return in committee will be disappointed, that the judge will side with them. Could you just walk us through the legal argument against the furnishing of these returns? Because White House doesn't seem worried about this in the least.
Well, the only thing that would argue against the release of the returns to the chairman is that there's not a legitimate public purpose, that the oversight responsibilities that the House Ways and Means Committee has does not extend to this sort of review, or the legislation that we are considering is not a legitimate legislative initiative that shouldn't be informed by this review. It's very difficult for me to accept that the president himself gets to decide what the level of review that Congress is going to apply to a tax question might be, or to argue that it's not a legitimate public purpose. We believe that it's fairly clear. We are considering whether or not the IRS is properly applying the tax laws of the United States by auditing and enforcing tax law on the president, and we're considering legislative changes toward that end, we need, the chairman that is, needs access to the information in order to make that determination and determine to what extent we need to make policy changes. The idea that either the White House or the IRS, which obviously works under the jurisdiction of the Treasury Department, could simply say, no, we don't think that's legitimate. Congress gets to determine we get to determine for ourselves where we want to go with policy deliberations. It's not up to them to determine that for us. And that would be the argument.
The president has said many times that he will release his tax returns. It's just that he's under audit. Do we know that he is in fact under audit? And also, does that matter?
First of all, it does not matter. There's nothing about a tax return being under audit that exempts it from Section 6103, nor is there anything about a return being audited that would prohibit the taxpayer from releasing that tax return. The president used that as the excuse during the campaign, saying, well, I will release my returns, but I'm not going to do it because I'm under audit. That's a choice that he's making. That is not a requirement. That is a choice, some would say an excuse that he's using to not release those returns. But to your other question, we do not know if the president's tax returns are under audit. There's no legal requirement that they be audited. It has been a practice of the IRS to audit presidential tax returns to take away any discretion that the IRS might have. But we're troubled by the way this president has administered the executive branch, and even further troubled by the notion that there has been communication between the IRS and the White House over the very question as to whether these returns ought to be released. That implies a level of communication between the White House and what is supposed to be an independent agency that equally administers the law over every taxpayer, including the president. The fact that there's been that sort of communication even raises our concern to an even higher level.
Congressman, to that point about the IRS and the audit that's going on right now, the federal government, in fact, the people best positioned to see if there's any malfeasance, if there's anything going on that's criminal or shady, they already have Donald Trump's tax returns and are going through it. So when you raise the issue of oversight, and we know that the president also has released extensive personal financial disclosure forms, what do you realistically think? I mean, why is there this Democrat fixation on seeing what's in these returns, considering the federal government already has them? And I mean, I joke around with my colleague here, there's not going to be a canceled check from the Kremlin to Trump for election interference. Like, there's not going to be anything that's some bombshell. So what do you really think you're going to find?
Well, I would take issue with one of your characterizations. You say that we already have access to these tax returns to provide oversight.
The federal government does.
The oversight, the federal government does, but the oversight you're referring to is an appointee of the president having oversight over the president that appointed him. Let's be clear about that. I don't consider that adequate oversight. We're talking about congressional oversight of the executive branch, something that is fundamental to our system of government, the separation of powers and the oversight responsibility that we have over the other branches of government. That's what we're referring to. And, you know, I'm not suggesting that there is some bombshell or some sort of cartoonish aha moment that will occur. But look at, this is a president who has broken from this norm. And this whole matter wouldn't be necessary if the president would simply do what every president since Richard Nixon has done, particularly this president who claims to control vast wealth, and we assume he does. But it's not just that he's not been come clean with the American people and released his tax returns, but also that he continues to maintain substantial control over his personal wealth. He did not, for example, do what also has been a norm, and that is to put his assets in a blind trust. He has simply assigned those assets to the control of his children. And if anyone believes that he is not involved in the determinations that are being made about his own assets at the same time that he's making big decisions of a public nature that could affect his personal assets, I think that would be a cartoonish characterization. I think people know Donald Trump well enough to know that he's going to protect his own interest. We have a right in this country to know whether or not the president's personal financial interests are impacting his public decision making. That's why the norms that this president has violated has caused us to have to take this sort of unusual step.
Congressman, let me ask you a quick political question. You're up there in Michigan, represent Flint. How have the GM layoffs impacted people's view of the president there?
Well, it's pretty devastating to the communities, by the way. I mean, the fact that 14,000 Americans who work hard are losing their jobs so that the company can build up its production capacity in Mexico is really frustrating. But when the president came to Michigan and came to Ohio, he told people, it's okay. You're not going to lose your job. He promised no factory would close. He told the people of Youngstown, Ohio, don't sell your houses. The factory is going to be open. He made those promises. Now, we knew he couldn't make those promises. I never expected the president would have the authority to reach into General Motors and dictate to them the decisions that they make. But the idea that he would cynically go to these communities and make these hopeful promises and give them assurances that even he knew he could not keep has caused, I think, even more cynicism among those people. Now they see the person that they expected was going to, quote, bring back the jobs has also let them down. And I think he and the party that he represents is going to pay a bit of a price for that in Michigan.
What Democrat do you think who's running or thinking about running would have the best shot at winning Michigan back?
Well, you know, I haven't made any determinations. I want to see how they do in Michigan. I want to see people come into my state and talk to the people of my state. You know, and I've got a lot of friends running. My buddy Tim Ryan just announced that he's running for president. I know he's going to spend some time in Michigan. Beto O'Rourke is a person that I've known really well. He's going to be spending some time in Michigan. Amy Klobuchar, who comes from Minnesota, I think will play well. But there are a lot of great candidates out there. I'm not suggesting those are the three that I would pick between. But I do think it's important that we look at a candidate who can go to Pennsylvania, can go to Ohio, can go to Michigan, can go to Wisconsin, and speak to those anxious voters who somehow saw in Donald Trump the savior who has obviously failed to appear, and speak sort of candidly and truthfully to them about the challenges we face and let them know what they will do to try to make things right and make things better. If you can win Michigan, you can win the White House. So I'm going to take a close look at who can come into my state and capture those the imagination of those people who are just looking for a path forward.
Always great to see you, Congressman. Thanks so much for the time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Next on Rising, one woman's story of going from a Planned Parenthood director to an anti-abortion activist.
She is going to share more about her journey and the new movie chronicling it when Rising continues.